Just a few nights ago on December 21st, there was a celestial event that had not happened in about 800 years. Saturn and Jupiter came into alignment, or at least they came closer together than they had come in 800 years. And if you went outside to watch it like my family and I did, when these two planets came together, it looked almost like one star. And it was the brightest thing shining in the night sky other than the moon. Now, I know that I am not the only one in here who saw this, because the next morning, a lot of you were posting on Facebook pictures that you had taken. A lot of you went out to see this event as well. And I saw a lot of you talking about this as the Bethlehem star, this alignment of Saturn and Jupiter. Well, the reason this event is known as the Bethlehem star is that there are a lot of people who believe that the star that the Magi saw, which led them to Jesus, was this exact phenomenon. And the reason people believe this is because in first century Persia, a region that first century Jews thought of as the East, Persians thought of Jupiter as the star associated with kings, and they thought of Saturn as the star associated with Jews. And so the alignment of these two stars coming together would have indicated to Persian stargazers that a king was being born in Israel, a Jewish king. But there's more to it than this. Remember that before December 21st, just a few days ago, it had been 800 years since this event had happened, meaning that it is incredibly rare. And yet, according to the astronomical records that we have, in the year that we are pretty sure Jesus was born in, this event happened 3 times. Right? It hadn't happened in 800 years until just a few days ago, but in that year, it happened 3 times. And so to a group of Persian stargazers, this alignment tells them that a Jewish king is being born. But when this incredibly rare event happens 3 times in the same year, it tells them that this is not just any king. This is a king of kings. Now, we do not know for sure if the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn is, in fact, the Bethlehem star which led the Magi to Jesus. There are some details in Mathew which suggest that it might not be. For example, there is no reason that we know of why Jupiter and Saturn aligning would have led the Magi directly to the house where Jesus and his family were staying in Bethlehem. So we don't know for sure if that's what this is. But if it is, then what we saw on December 21st is a real-life example of the heavens declaring the glory of the Lord. Now, whether or not the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn was what led the Magi to Jesus, or if it was another star that they saw entirely, there is something that we do know. We know that the Magi, based on their response to what they saw, were people whose hearts were truly open to the truth of God. They were what we might call seekers. Now, a seeker is someone whose mind is curious about the truth of God. And the nature of that curiosity is such that they live with a kind of restlessness in their hearts, a restlessness that persists until they find the answers to the questions that they're looking for. The fact that these Magi were willing to set off on a journey to worship a child halfway across the known world at that time tells us that in their quest for truth, all of the answers that they'd found up until that point had left them unsatisfied. And so if there was a chance that they could find the truth in the form of a child halfway across the world, then they were going to take that chance and they were going to go to that child. In America today, and in fact throughout the entire Western world, there is a lot of talk about the decline of the church. And, all of the data that we have on church attendance over the last 100 years seems to indicate that the church in the West is declining. Now, this certainly is not the case for the global church. When you consider the rate at which the church is growing in places like Africa and the Far East, even when you take into consideration the decline of church attendance in the West, the church as a whole is still growing. It is still vibrant. And not only this, but in his book, Onward, Russell Moore makes the case that what we are seeing in America is not so much the decline of the true church as it is the decline of cultural Christianity. In other words, church attendance numbers in America, they're not in decline because there are now somehow fewer people who are truly devoted followers of Christ. Those numbers are in decline because people who are not truly devoted followers of Christ are a lot less likely to go to church now because of all of the cultural reasons that people used to go to church. Does that make sense? Okay. And so church attendance may be in decline, but the true church is still healthy and growing. The true church hasn't gone anywhere. And you want to know else? You want to know who else has not gone anywhere? Seekers. Seekers have not gone anywhere. As a matter of fact, if you look at the data, you see that as traditional church attendance has declined, the number of seekers has actually risen. According to the Pew Research Center, about 3% of Americans consider themselves to be atheists. 3%. That's about the same percentage that considered themselves to be atheists 100 years ago. Which tells us that as people are discontinuing their attendance of traditional church, they aren't rejecting the idea of God entirely. They are still open to the idea of God. And not only that, many of them are actively seeking God. C.S. Lewis is one of the best examples from the 20th century of what it means to be a seeker. When he writes about his own life as a seeker before he became a Christian, he writes about an inconsolable longing, a yearning, the feeling of intensely missing something that he didn't even know what it was he was missing, but he knew he was missing something. This sense of longing, this sense that we are just missing something, that's a universal part of the human experience. And the effort to satisfy this longing is something that we all engage in. Some people attempt to satisfy it by losing themselves in books or television or movies. Some people attempt to satisfy it by pursuing money or food or drink or sex. We've all spent some time trying to satisfy this longing in the wrong places. But this sense of longing, it's actually something that God has created within us to lead us back to Himself. As St. Augustine puts it, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord. And so our hearts are restless until we find our rest in you." And so, if this experience of longing is common to all people, it means that the people you and I come into contact with every day are people who are experiencing that longing. It means that the people you and I are coming into contact with every day are seeking. And so it's important for us to consider how we as Christians should relate to those who are seeking. How we should relate to those who are seeking. In Matthew chapter 2, which Pastor Zach read for us this morning, I think Mary gives us an excellent example. When the Magi arrive at her doorstep, she invites them into her home and introduces them to Jesus. You know, back when this country was more culturally Christian, people naturally assumed that if you wanted to find God, where did you go? You went to church. That's right. Not only that, but the church naturally assumed that new people who walked through their doors were already basically familiar with the story of the gospel. And so back then, the way seekers found Jesus was they went to church, they heard a presentation of the gospel, and they walked down the aisle. Now, does it still happen like that? Sometimes it does. Sometimes it happens exactly like that, because the Holy Spirit absolutely still works when we present the gospel to people who are seeking. But typically, the process is just a little bit different these days. In 2020, a person who is spiritually seeking does not automatically assume that they're going to find the answers to their questions in a church. They haven't ruled the church out as a possibility. It's just that they're going to look for some answers in some other places as well. Now, and the fact of the matter is, there's actually a whole lot of other places that they're going to try before they try the church. And even then, most people are not going to give church a try unless one of us invites them. And here's where the matter really comes down to brass tacks. Even if one of us invites a person to church who is seeking, they are probably not going to accept our invitation unless they consider us to be a friend. You know, one of the things that I hear church members say when we talk about sharing the gospel or inviting people to church is that they'll say, well, I've tried inviting people to church, but they won't come. Or I've tried sharing the gospel with people and they don't respond. And if that's something that you've experienced, then I have a question for you. Before inviting that person to church, have you ever tried inviting them into your home? Have you ever tried inviting them into your home? And you might ask, what does that have to do with anything? What does inviting someone into my home have to do with inviting them to church? Well, here's a thought. Because when you invite someone into your home, when you prepare a meal and you invite them to share it with you, there is a bond of trust that is established in that moment. There is a bond of friendship that is established. When you invite a person into your home, your relationship with them goes beyond merely a friendly acquaintance, and it enters into the territory of friendship. There is a trust that's established between you and them. And once that trust is established, and that person knows that you really do have their best interest at heart, then when you do invite them to church, they become a lot more likely to accept that invitation because they trust you. You know, faith is a deeply personal thing for most people. When people are seeking, when they are looking for the answers to life's big questions, they're not going to take the word of a stranger, right? When people are searching for the answers to life's big questions, they're not going to take the word of a friendly acquaintance. Who are they going to look to? They're going to look to people that they trust. People trust their friends. And so, if you're one of those folks who has shared the gospel or invited people to church only to get turned down, my advice to you is that next time, maybe try inviting them into your home first. Develop a relationship with them. Become friends with them. Establish trust. And please, I beg you, when you do invite people into your home, do it because you genuinely want to be their friend. And not just because you want to give them a sales pitch about Jesus. People are smart. They can smell a sales pitch from a mile away. Do it because you genuinely want to be their friend. Take the time to intentionally build a true friendship with a new person. You know, this idea of building a true friendship with a new person, some of you in here, you hear this and it sounds easy to you. There are some people in here who naturally are good at building friendships with new people. And so it sounds simple. But there's others of you in here who hear this and you think to yourself, well, that sounds like a lot of hard work, right? You know, you're having to lay the groundwork of building a friendship. And you're right, that is hard work, building a friendship. It requires time. It requires intentionality. And perhaps most difficult at all, it requires that we make ourselves vulnerable. It requires that we make ourselves vulnerable. And so I want us to spend some time focusing on this idea of making ourselves vulnerable. Because we cannot be friends with someone. We cannot build a friendship with someone if we have our guard up all of the time. There is no way for a friendship to flourish that way. You know, when you invite a stranger to church, when you invite a friendly acquaintance to church, that's a low-risk proposition, isn't it? You know, if they say no to that question, well, then you can just kind of write that off as, well, this person, they're just not interested in organized religion, right? No skin off your back. But if you're trying to take a friendly acquaintance and make them a friend, if you are inviting that stranger to become your friend and they reject that proposition, well, that's a little more personal, isn't it? Right? And so vulnerability is so important. Being willing to risk that is so important in building new friendships. And it's actually something that Jesus modeled for us. We see it over and over again in the New Testament. When God left His glory and dwelled among us as a human, don't you see how that is an act of vulnerability? And He didn't just come to us as a human. He came to us as the most vulnerable kind of human, a baby. A baby born into poverty, without any of the protections that might have been afforded to a more wealthy child. No, a poor child whose very first bed was a manger that animals ate out of. Do you see how vulnerable that is? And not only that, but in Mathew 2, this visit from the Magi illustrates just how vulnerable Jesus willingly made Himself. Because as soon as Herod finds out that a rival for his throne might possibly have been born in Bethlehem, what does he do? He tries to kill Jesus. Now think about Jesus' teaching. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us that if someone slaps us on the face, what should we do? We turn the other cheek. That is vulnerability. When we encounter an enemy, what are we supposed to do? We love them. How easy is it to love someone when our guard is up all of the time? And there's a reason Jesus asks us to do this, is because ultimately the way to defeat an enemy is to make them a friend, right? That is a risky proposition that Jesus is calling us to. It requires vulnerability. And so what is Jesus trying to teach us through all of this, if not the importance of making ourselves vulnerable? And then, at the end of His time with us on earth, Jesus performs the greatest act of vulnerability in all of history as He makes Himself vulnerable to death, even death on a cross. And why did He do all of this? He did this to restore a relationship of love between God and people. And love requires vulnerability. It requires that we let our guard down in order to let the other person into our lives. And if this is something that you struggle with, look to Jesus, because he modeled this for us. The Apostle Paul says it best in Philippians 2 when he says, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." In your relationships with one another, Paul says, have the same mindset as Jesus. Jesus, who humbled himself and lowered his defenses for our sake. As 2020 comes to an end, and as we set out on 2021, my hope is that each of us will take time sometime this year to develop a friendship with someone who maybe isn't a Christian. And along the way, we may find out that our new friend is also a seeker. And if that's the case, then we'll have the same opportunity that Mary had in Matthew chapter 2. An opportunity to invite our friend into our home and introduce them to Jesus.